Hey Podcast Aquanauts, it's your host Casey here. We've had a lot of fun on the Good Ship Podcast Aquatic, haven't we? To date, we've delved into some really fun topics like cookie cutter sharks and cicada broods or Appalachian alligators, but today it's time to talk about something a little bit heavier. In this episode, we're going to delve into extinction and, more specifically, the steps that humans are taking to try and establish much-needed protections for species that are at risk of disappearing, usually because, spoiler, humans aren't always the best neighbors. Now, extinction is a big, scary word. It's heavy and final. It brings to mind things like asteroid strikes, pandemics, nuclear winter, and other terrifying cataclysms. But sometimes extinction isn't caused by some theatrical world-shaking event. It can be brought on by seemingly mundane and unassuming causes like drought or an animal that finds itself in the wrong place. Believe it or not, even dirt can be the stuff of doom. For all its grim undertones, extinction is a natural occurrence. Animals and plants naturally disappear due to environmental changes and ecological shifts. Looking at the fossil record, scientists estimate that the baseline, or so-called background extinction rate on Earth, is one species disappearing for every million other species. That averages out to 10 to 100 species going extinct per year, including tiny things like microbes, insects, fungi, and bacteria. Sometimes, however, something radical happens that can lead to species disappearing faster than this. During these relatively brief periods, geologically speaking at least, something happens that causes animals and plants to disappear at rates far exceeding the background extinction rate. These are what scientists call mass extinction events. And to date, based on evidence in the fossil record, scientists estimate that there have been 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history. As I said earlier, it isn't always a huge doomsday event that brings it about. In fact, many scientists think Earth is currently in the midst of a 6th mass extinction event, the Holocene extinction brought on by, you guessed it, us. But it does nobody any good to paint humanity's role in the current loss of species around the world with too broad a brush. Humans may be responsible for the rapid disappearance of these animals and plants, but we're also, some of us at least, doing the best we can to try to turn the tide through research and landmark legislation like the Endangered Species Act of 1973. On today's episode of the podcast, I'm excited to introduce 2 people who definitely qualify as good guys. Conservation scientists at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute who are working to better understand and protect southeastern aquatic species before they become another statistic. And with that admittedly morose intro out of the way, let's get to it, shall we? On with the podcast. Hello, and thank you for joining us for one of the first episodes of the podcast Aquatic. That's the new podcast for the Tennessee Aquarium. And we thought today that we would cover actually a pretty broad topic, but hopefully we can get in and out of this topic in 30 minutes or less. But that would be the Endangered Species Act. And there are a couple of news events that have happened recently that warrant discussion. But before I get too far into that topic, let me introduce our guests for today. So this is Dr. Anna George, our Vice President of Conservation Science and Education here at the Aquarium.
Good job remembering that long title.
Oh, I have to write it a lot. So, and Dr. Bernie Kuhajda, who is an aquatic conservation biologist here at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute.
And I'm glad to be here.
So thank you both for joining me. And for those who don't know, I am Casey Phillips. I'm the communications specialist here at the Tennessee Aquarium. And I don't want to just throw the words Endangered Species Act out and then just run out of the room. So why don't we start by just, what is the Endangered Species Act?
So the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which we are going to abbreviate a lot to ESA. So just so everyone is ready right now, if we say ESA or Endangered Species Act, all the same thing. This is really the main legal framework we have for protection of biodiversity here in the United States.
And without this legal framework to protect a lot of our aquatic species here in the Southeast, we would have had a lot more extinctions than we have.
And because Bernie has accused me of being big picture, I will back up even farther for just a second and say the ESA was part of a lot of big environmental legislation that all happened at the beginning of the 1970s. So we saw the National Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the ESA all kind of happen within this really exciting 4-year period where a lot of this thought and thinking about the environment kind of culminated in these big protections that we have and what has really changed the landscape of conservation for the U.S. to this day.
And the Clean Water Act has worked great in cleaning up most of our big rivers. But where it's really struggling to make an impact is in our smaller water bodies.
Okay, but we're not doing Clean Water Act today.
I know.
That's true. That'll need to be a future episode.
That'll
I
be
think.
future.
But a lot of our species that are on the list, most of them are in small creeks and headwater streams that the Clean Water Act really doesn't help at the moment. But we're working on it.
So let's talk about the news event that is the reason why we're all gathered in this room together, which for me at least was when I read that the lake sturgeon, which is a species that we've worked with here at the aquarium for more than 20 years. It was not designated. Is that right?
That is correct. To explain the lake sturgeon, we have to back up and explain a little bit more about how the ESA works. And so just because something is considered biologically endangered or threatened does not mean it's afforded all the protections of the ESA. What the ESA does is it establishes a process by which anyone, citizens, groups can petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA and ask for a species to be considered for protection under the ESA. What happens then is that sets off a process by which the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA go through a very formalized review, and they gather as much scientific data as available to decide whether protection is warranted or not. And if you notice that I'm using specific language, it's because we're talking about law today. So all the terms I'm using are actually written into the ESA. So these findings of whether a species is warranted protection under the ESA or not. So what just happened is that a group had petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that the lake sturgeon should be considered endangered in the United States. The Fish and Wildlife Service went through their review process, and at the end of it, they decided that no, protection at the federal level was not warranted for the lake sturgeon at this time. Again, federal is another way of saying national level. There are states that have their own mechanisms for listing and protecting species, and so the lake sturgeon is considered endangered by the state of Tennessee, but it is not considered endangered by the U.S. federal government under the ESA.
In fact, all the southeastern states list the lake sturgeon as state protected. And that may have the word endangered in it. It just may be state protected, but they all mean the same thing. If you catch a lake sturgeon, you have to immediately release it, and there's no commercial harvest of lake sturgeon for their eggs for caviar or any other reason.
Which is one of the reasons why the lake sturgeon is in the state that it is in Tennessee. Overfishing for caviar and poor water quality and a lot of those other things that we've been trying for 20 years to undo.
Yeah, so you're getting a little glimpse behind the curtain that for a species that's as wide-ranging as the lake sturgeon, I mean, this is a fish that can be found throughout eastern North America into Canada, at least historically it could be found all these places. Things are different across the range of an animal with a range that large. And so basically what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is saying is, yes, there are places where lake sturgeon may not be doing as well, but we see in those regions that they have started conservation programs, and the trend that we're seeing is recovery of the lake sturgeon. Because of conservation programs like the Tennessee Aquarium's work with our partners across this region, we're seeing recovery of lake sturgeon, and perhaps it's fair to say that, no, I don't think listing under the Endangered Species Act is the right move. Now, that doesn't mean we're ready to pull it off of the state lists. It doesn't mean we as the Tennessee Aquarium, ready to just walk away and say no more work is required. I think it's pretty exciting because it shows you the many different ways we can go about biodiversity protection and how sometimes the ESA is a really important tool, and sometimes that may not actually be what a species needs at that moment in time.
And also, this does point to the fact that it's just not restoring habitat, but it's also then allowing the fishes to come back either naturally or, in the case of the lake sturgeon, through reintroduction, through stocking, which the Tennessee Aquarium and all of the partners have been involved in since the first lake sturgeon were released in 2000.
That is such a monumental project. I mean, we've released to date, the last number that I have, and it may be you may have more up-to-date numbers than I do, was 330,000 fish.
That's the number I'm still using.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll go up again this fall when we do the fall releases.
And I believe those are just in the Tennessee and Cumberland River systems. And then the state of Georgia has a completely different number. I don't know exactly what that is in the Coosa River system of the Mobile Basin, which was the southernmost population in the southeast.
So what I'm getting from this, and what I think is probably a surprise to some people who maybe don't know as much as the two of you do about the ESA is that just being listed on the Endangered Species Act isn't a death sentence. It's not like entering hospice care. You're not waiting to die. These species aren't waiting to die. It can actually be a good thing.
No, the whole point of the Endangered Species Act is that this allows us to see what species need help and to provide some ways to either funnel help to them or to prevent actions by the federal government that may jeopardize these species further. And I think what's surprising to a lot of people is the rigor that the government imposes on itself in terms of how they consider what species live in areas where they are taking actions, and then how they go through the process of trying to protect species through grant programs, through active recovery with partners. And what it really does is provides a way for us to very quickly understand which species are in trouble, identify where those species occur, and then figure out ways that we might reverse that problem for the animal.
There are a lot of species that are imperiled across the Southeast, especially aquatic species. They are 3 to 5 times more likely to go extinct than marine or terrestrial animals. So it's a really threatened ecosystem.
So what is it about a freshwater species that puts them more at risk of imperilment than the terrestrial or marine species?
Everything within a watershed, from the ridges down to the shoreline of the rivers, affects fresh water. Everything that happens upstream of an area flows downstream. Even things downstream of an area you're trying to protect can affect the upstream habitat, such as putting a dam in and having that free-flowing area now impounded, or doing some channelization, straightening the river to avoid potential flooding. Then that causes a whole bunch of changes upstream. The bottom gets deeper and the banks get wider, and it just really alters the habitat. You can put refuge on land, put a fence around it, and pretty much protect it. Now, if you have large animals that migrate a lot, you need migration corridors. But you just can't put a fence around freshwater habitat, especially in rivers and streams that are flowing, because everything in the watershed affects that one area you're trying to protect, or that one species or one ecosystem.
It's dynamic.
Very dynamic.
And then to go back to a metaphor I use a lot, since we already mentioned hospice care, our river systems throughout the country are like a circulatory system. So these are a two-dimensional network where we don't have a lot of wiggle room outside of that space. If we're suffering from a coronary heart disease and you go to the doctor to seek treatment for that, they're not going to say, yeah, let's put a fence around your hand and keep your hand as healthy as we possibly can, and the rest of your circulatory system will be just fine. But that's unfortunately the approach that we've taken to a lot of conservation in the country, is to create these reserves that absolutely work for a terrestrial conservation approach, but do nothing when we look at the problems that we have across the rivers and streams.
Is that disheartening to as freshwater scientists to have to face working?
Oh no, we like a challenge.
Exactly. It really is a complicated mosaic of issues you've got to deal with, but it is a challenge, and you have to be an optimist to be in this field for sure.
So let's talk about some of the active work that we're doing out here at the Conservation Institute. You do work with some endangered species. What are, or threatened species? So what are some of the species that we are actively involved in studying or protecting?
Well, I'm going to toss to Bernie because one of the first ones that comes to mind is the Barron's top minnow, which when we started working with the Barron's top minnow was not actually protected under the Endangered Species Act. During the time period we've been working with it, unfortunately, the situation has changed and it is now protected, not as a result of our actions, which is why I'm kind of chuckling over here, but it goes to show you how difficult these situations are. But Bernie's definitely the lead on that.
Yeah, that happened in 2019 with the
Correct.
designation.
And there are a lot of different reasons why a species gets in trouble. A lot of our species listed under the ESA have a really restricted, narrow range. So any tweaks to their habitat can really put them on the endangered species list really quickly compared to a wide-ranging species. That's a Barron's top minnow. It's only found in the headwaters of the Duck, Elk, and Collins River around Manchester, Tennessee, in that general area on the Barron's Plateau.
So that's west of Chattanooga for those
West
of you
of
who aren't
Chattanooga,
boned up on your
yes.
Tennessee geography.
On the other side of Mont Eagle. And it would probably be doing okay. The springs that it lives in are in pretty good shape, but an invasive species, the mosquito fish, was introduced back in the 60s and 70s, and it completely outcompetes the Barron's top minnow when it gets into its habitat, and in 3 to 5 years they disappear. And for 14 years, the Tennessee Aquarium and its partners tried a reintroduction program and a program to add more Barron's top minnows to existing populations. And it worked great until mosquito fish found their way into those habitats, and then it did not matter what kind of stocking you did with Barron's top minnows. It made no difference. And so this is really a hard species to recover when you have this small little fish that lives right on the edges of the streams. It's almost impossible. It is impossible to get rid of. A really great discovery in 2022 was a new population of Barron's top minnows right up against the Cumberland Plateau, that there are no mosquito fish anywhere in that area. And so we are hoping that we can keep the mosquito fish out of there, and we will have one really good, healthy population. But it is really a species on the edge of extinction.
So you mentioned recovery. The point of being on the list, as Anna pointed out earlier, is we're hoping to get them off the list. I mean, it's supposed to be, ideally, it's a temporary designation. So surely there are some examples of species that we've managed to turn the tide. Yes, turn the tide. Thank you. I'm mixing my metaphors.
Well, I think it's important to know the different categories under the Endangered Species Act, which we haven't really covered yet. So, the most obvious one, of course, is an endangered species, and that's the highest level of risk, but also protection provided by the Endangered Species Act. So you can be considered an endangered species or a threatened species, which means, not quite so dire yet, but certainly not looking good. And so sometimes what we see in terms of recovery is something getting what's called downlisted. So they move from endangered to threatened, perhaps. Sometimes the recovery would be delisted in terms of being moved from endangered or threatened just off the list entirely. There are some unfortunate categories as well. Sometimes things are delisted due to extinction. And what that means is essentially we have decided this species is most likely extinct in the wild. It is, in many cases, impossible to officially declare something extinct and actually know that for a complete fact. But there is levels of probability, of course, that we can assume. So you can have something delisted due to extinction. We can also see species that are listed due to similarity of appearance.
What are some examples of that?
So an example I was actually directly involved in was listing the shovel-nosed sturgeon, which is a very cool freshwater sturgeon that lives in the Mississippi River Basin. So in Tennessee, that would include the Mississippi River proper, and historically it was in the Tennessee River. It was listed as threatened due to similarity of appearance because it looks very similar to an endangered species, another riverine species, the pallid sturgeon. It's a big river fish that has only been found in the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. And there is a commercial harvest of shovel-nosed sturgeon for females' eggs for caviar. I was on the pallid sturgeon recovery team, and we were trying to get states to stop allowing commercial fishing for shovel-nosed sturgeon in the same habitat where pallid sturgeon occurred, in the Mississippi River proper, up to the mouth of the Missouri River in Illinois, Missouri, and then up the Missouri River. So I actually went to the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency Commission in 2008 to explain how even river biologists and taxonomists, scientists that name species, had a very difficult time distinguishing between shovel-nosed sturgeon and pallid sturgeon. They're found in exactly the same habitat. It's just the length of the snout and the placement of the little whiskers in front of their mouth, barbels. But to complicate this, the two species also hybridize. So you pretty much have pure shovel-nose, pure pallid, and every variation thereof in between. And it's almost impossible on a boat for someone to distinguish between the endangered species and the common species. So the only way to protect the endangered pallid sturgeon was to list the shovel-nosed sturgeon as threatened due to similarity of appearance. And that forced the states to stop commercial fishing in those areas for shovel-nosed sturgeon because it was impossible to protect the pallid sturgeon. Huge amounts of resources were going into pallid sturgeon recovery with hatcheries and stocking pallid sturgeon throughout the range. And we didn't want to stock pallid sturgeon so commercial fishermen could catch ripe females for caviar. We wanted to stock them for recovery of the species, and this was the only way to do it. The listing of the shovel-nosed sturgeon just happened in 2010.
So yeah, getting back to Casey's question, though, absolutely we see things that have moved off the list or have been downgraded. The best example from the Southeast was actually last fall, September 2023, with the relict darter in Kentucky. You want to take that one?
Sure. That is a darter that has a really unique habitat. And a darter is a little fish that doesn't have a swim bladder, and it darts around on the bottom of the stream. And they invert the male and female and lay their eggs on the underside of a log or rocks. And so obviously you need woody debris or rocks in a stream for them to be successful. This fish is only found in one small creek system, Bayou de Chien, in western Kentucky. And it was endangered because a lot of the streams out there had been channelized. There were no trees, a riparian zone lining the banks, so there was no spawning habitat for these fishes, no rocks, no woody debris. A lot of best management practices have gone into the agricultural areas around these streams. They've actually put in and anchored woody debris for spawning habitat and reestablished a lot of these riparian zones, these trees along the streams. The population in the 30 years since it was listed in 1993 has really risen. So Fish and Wildlife had the data they needed to downlist the species from endangered to threatened. And that was just a lot of hard work by a lot of different agencies, partnerships, and private landowners to improve the habitat for the species.
One other example that comes to mind is the snail darter.
Yeah, absolutely. So the snail darter is an example of the ESA in so many different ways. I mean, we can talk about courts, we can talk about politics, but let's not. Let's talk about the biology. So the snail darter was originally listed as endangered due to more populations being both discovered as well as transplanted. The snail darter was downlisted to threatened and then finally delisted in October 2022. So no longer under the Endangered Species Act, which is a pretty big deal considering that the snail darter was one of the first species that there was ever even a Supreme Court case about with the ESA. So the snail darter has always been kind of an exceptional endangered species of the Southeast. It's the one everyone knows. It's the one everyone is quite familiar with the power of the ESA when it comes to the snail darter, and it's just a cool little fish. I'm so glad it's still around.
the situation with the snail darter that drew national attention happened almost simultaneous with the passage of the act, didn't it?
Yes and no. So there was some legal protection for biodiversity prior to the ESA. That was the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was already starting to figure out some of their mechanisms for recovery. Then in 73, when the ESA comes to light, you start to see that being ramped up. And then with the snail darter, I think it was around 1975 when it was discovered and listed very quickly. This was all due to some construction in Little Tennessee River of dams, and so the Tellico Dam in particular. In 1978 was the pivotal Supreme Court case involving the snail darter, and that was TVA versus Hill.
And what has happened since? The Clean Water Act. Once again, it has really cleaned up our big rivers. And then TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, improved water quality below their dams with minimum flows, bubbling oxygen in some dams. And it really allowed the snail darter to expand its range downstream for where it was originally found in Tennessee into Alabama and eventually Bear Creek on the Alabama-Mississippi border. And it's found in several tributaries now in those downstream areas. It's really just expanded its range amazingly over these several decades. And yeah, it was time to get it off the list.
Well, and as you pointed out, I mean, the fact that a freshwater fish was able to come off the list is even more noteworthy probably than the more maybe well-known success stories like the California condor or the grizzly bear. I think the American alligator at one point was imperiled, and now obviously their numbers have bounced back quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people expect recovery to always be the outcome. Removing a species from the list is always the outcome. With a lot of the freshwater animals that we have who have such small native ranges, as Bernie mentioned earlier, we don't know that delisting is ever actually a possibility for some of those, but that doesn't mean it's a failure. Recognizing that a species is special is only found in a few locations, and if those few locations are threatened, we would lose that species. I think that is an important consequence of the act. And so it is totally fine to me that some of these species that do have an incredibly small native range, they might live the entirety of their existence with protection. And to us as biologists, that's okay. That doesn't mean the act is failing. The counter argument to that would be like, so what are you going to do? Introduce them to other locations and make them invasive? That's a terrible plan. So delisting isn't always a possibility, but recognizing that the list makes sure we are aware of and protect these spots that have a high number of species that are found nowhere else on Earth is part of the point.
And what this does is not allow those species to go extinct. It preserves our natural heritage that we find right in our backyard, and it also preserves all those building blocks of the aquatic ecosystem, which humans rely on for clean drinking water and clean rivers to play in. They are the canaries in the coal mine. If we start losing species to extinction, if we start getting a whole bunch of species on the endangered species list, we know our aquatic habitats are in trouble. A heart attack's coming, getting back to Anna's analogy, and it's time to do something. An example of that is the laurel dace, an endangered species we work with up on Walden Ridge near Spring City.
That's immediately in our backyard.
It is literally a 40-minute drive from here to laurel dace habitat. And this is a fish that lives in mountain headwater streams. The habitat is bedrock and boulders with these pools that they thrive in. These are gorgeous fish. They have gold and red and black and yellow fins. And unfortunately, when I started working here 12 years ago, they were found in 5 streams. It's down to 2 streams.
And this is a fish that we feel very attached to. This fish was actually described by a friend and collaborator of ours, Chris Skelton. We, the Aquarium, wrote the recovery plan for the laurel dace under contract with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've developed propagation plans. We've worked on protocols for how to spawn laurel dace. We can do all these things except we don't have a place to release laurel dace that are spawned in human care. So that led us to the next action, which is if there's nowhere that we can release them right now, then we need to start working on their habitats so that we do have a place in the future to release laurel dace if we're able to spawn them in human care. So that's part of the huge pivot we're making right now through the Ridges to Rivers Regional Conservation Partnership Program that we have underway with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and really trying to work directly with farmers and landowners on Walden Ridge and really encouraging them towards agricultural practices that both keep their soil on the land where they need it for farming, but then also keep it out of laurel dace habitat in the creeks. So, it's a lot of work for one small species, but at the same time, if we can't do this for the laurel dace, really what's the point of having the aquarium if not to tackle projects like this?
There's so much going on with the laurel dace here at the aquarium that I almost feel like that could be a podcast
that's
topic
fair.
unto itself.
Definitely.
So I think we've done a pretty admirable job of covering the topic of what the Endangered Species Act is, why it was created, how it protects species, and how it's not actually the death knell that a lot of people maybe think it is to end up on the list. So I think we'll end it there to try and keep this to a fairly brief runtime. We will revisit Tenacity and the two of you in future episodes of the podcast Aquatic. But thank you again for the fun discussion and the clarity.
Anytime we can talk about fish, we're in.
Yes, this is so much fun.
If you have any ideas for future episodes of the podcast Aquatic or a question that maybe we can pose to one of our experts here at the aquarium, send your suggestion or your question to podcast@tnaqua.org.